Haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Tzadik Zayin Amud Beis, 11 lines from the top, almost a halfway down from the top of the Amud. The Gemara really is a hemshech of our previous Gemara, starting with a statement that Shmuel had made. He said, Chatas Meisa is a way to then know that the same scenario that takes place that requires a Chatas to be left to die, then that scenario would also be Gabe a Korban Pesach, you'd have to bring a Korban Shlomim. He says, if the Korban Chatas would be left to graze, then also the Korban Pesach would be left to graze. Now this is not a corollary, it's not that one follows from the next, only it's a way to remember, Shmuel says, what a Korban Pesach is designated for. Again, if the Chatas is going to have to die, then in the same scenario, the Korban Pesach will be brought as a Korban Shlomim. Where the Chatas is left to graze, the Korban Pesach would also be left to graze. The Gemara wants to understand what is that scenario where the Chatas is left to graze, that we would say the same thing would occur by the Korban Pesach. The Gemara explains that to mean in a scenario where the Korban Chatas was lost, and then subsequently the owner then designated another Korban Chatos, whereby he then found the original Korban Chatos before he then even brought the second Chatos. On that, we're suggesting that Shmuel is saying would be then something that the Chatos would be grazed, and then the Korban Pesach would be grazing. However, the Gemara asks that according to the Rabbanon, that's not so. In the scenario where the Chatos is found, then the Chatos itself, it's true, would be grazing, but the Korban Pesach is not that way, as the Gemara says now. Lishno achrino. V'ilu bePesach, in that scenario where the Pesach would be lost, and then a new Pesach was designated, and then the original Pesach was found, heicha da'ov v'nimtza acher chatzois, if it was found after chatzois, koidem shchita, but before the shchita, yikarev shlomim, he will bring a Korban Shlomim. So this is contradictory to Shmuel, because Shmuel said the same scenario that the Chatos would be roya, would be left to graze, would also then be so by a Korban Pesach, and we're seeing not like that. We're showing over here that according to the Chachamim, in that scenario, Korban Pesach would then be brought as a Korban Shlomim. The Gemara answers, Shmuel kirabba svira lei. Shmuel holds like Rabbah, the Omar Shchita Kova, that holds that Shchita is what is the determining factor. Now, what does that mean? That means that we explained in the Mishnah that if a Korban Pesach is lost, and then a new Korban Pesach is designated, whereby the original Korban Pesach is found. Well, it depends when it is found. The Mishnah says, if it's found before the Shchita, then indeed we say that the Korban Pesach then would have to one of those Korban Pesach would have to then be left to graze, because it was a nidchet, they called it Pesach dochui. However, if it was found after the Shechita, then we say that can be brought it's brought as a Korban Shlomim, the original one that was found. That is the Shita of Rabbah. Rabbi Zeira argued on that. Rabbi Zeira, he explained that it's not the Kodem or Achar, the Shechita, but Kodem or Achar Zman Shechita. And therefore, if you found the Korban Pesach before the Zman of the Shechita, that means before Chatzois, then indeed, you would go ahead and leave the Korban Pesach to then pasture. However, if you found it after Chatzois, even if it was before the Shechita, according to Rabbi Zeira, then you would indeed bring it as a Korban Shlomim. So that's what the Shlakavatari in our Gemara is saying. In the Havamina, the Gemara is asked that this is according to the sheet of Rabbi Zeira, that it goes by after Chatzois, or before Chatzois, and therefore if it's after Chatzois, even if it's before the Shechita, so then the din would be that you bring it as a Korban Shlomim. On that, the Gemara answers that Shmuel holds like Rabbah, that says that goes after the Shechita itself, not the Zman of the Shechita. And therefore, after the Shechita would be that over here, if it's found after Chatzos but before the Shechita, then you'd have to then leave it to pasture until it gets a mum. And that's what Shmuel was saying, whereby now Shmuel does not have a contradiction. That in the case of the Korban Chatos, there it's left to pasture. When it was found, the second Korban Chatos that was then designated, then the original one was found even before the Shechita, then we're saying it's left to pasture. So too over here, the Korban Pesach, in the same scenario, if it was found before the Shechita, it would also be considered to be Dochui, and thereby it would be left to pasture to get a mum. Ask the Gemara, behold, that which Rabbi Yochanan stated on Shmuel's statement, the following, Eina Pesach Korev Shlomim, that the Pesach is not brought as a Korban Shlomim, Elo Shenimtza Achar Shchita, Aval Kodim Shchita Loi, who said that specifically when it's going to be brought, when it's going to be found after the Shchita itself. Aval before the Shchita not. So you see that Rabbi Yochanan holds like Rabbi Zera, that's totally on before after the Shchita. Must be then that Shmuel, who Rabbi Yochanan is arguing on, does not hold like that, but rather holds like Rabbi Shita. Alma Shchita Kova. According to Rabbi Yochanan, the Shchita is what's Koveya. However, Michlal the Shmuel Sover Chatzos Kova. It follows therefore that Shmuel does not hold like that. That Shmuel really holds like the Shita of Rabbi Zera. So we're back left with the original question: how could that Shmuel say on the one hand that the Korban Chatos will be left to graze in that scenario where he lost the Korban Chatos, and then found his original one before the Shechita of the second Korban Chatos? There is going to be left to graze. In that same scenario by Korban Pesach, he would then be able to offer as a korban shlomim. Ella, says the Gemara, Shmuel karabi svirale, that Shmuel really goes like a Rebbe. Do Omar avuda lemisa azlo, who says that when it is lost, is going to then, this korban chatas that's lost, even if it's found before the shchita of the second designated korban chatos, that will then go to misa. That's Rebbe Shita. I asked the Gemara, "V'hokol avudin leRebbe mesin." Therefore, according to Rebbe, all avudin would be lemesin. V'ilu bePesach heichad ovad kodam chatzois v'ninsa kodam chatzois roya. But according to this, that would make it so that Rebbe, who says by a korban chatas would be mesa, but by a korban Pesach would come out that it would be then going to pasture. It will go out to graze. That would be the same din of a korban pesach that's found before chatzos. And that's again contradicting Shmuel's statement, because he started off by saying that a korban chatos that is lost, that korban chatos, in this case it will be lost, a korban chatos that would be chayev misa, the korban pesach in the same scenario would be offered as a korban shlomim, and here we see that's not so. So now the Gemara says, Kesovar koidem chatzos lav avurhu, that since he found it before chatzos, and that was not yet the designated time, so it's not considered to be avud. Now, the Gemara then, basically without stating it here, is reverting back to the same shakel of Vitaria that we had in the first version. And I'll even read it through. The Gemara then asks the question that says that he holds koidem chatzos lav avurhu, to which the Gemara then on the top of our Amud said that he holds like Rabbi Oshaya, that he was mafresh in the korban chatos, two different chatos. And I'll read it inside, the whole shakel of Vitaria, so it's clear. So the Gemara on the top of the Amud begins, the Omar Rabbi Oshaya, hifrish shtei chatos la'achrayis, that he took two different korban chatos, and he initially made it that in case one of them gets lost, then he'll have another korban chatos. So it says, what's the din in this scenario? Miskaper ba'achas mehen v'shniya tira. He'll get a kapar with one of them. The other one will go left to graze. Ask the Gemara. Now the Gemara could have asked right away, like Rashi points out, that here, this is not a case where it got lost. Al kopanim, the Gemara asked a better question. Va'ilu b'pesach ki agam nakarv shlomim. In the same scenario by korban Pesach, that in such a scenario, you would bring a korban shlomim. And we said, according to Shmuel, that when the carbon chatos is left to graze, the carbon pesach is also left to graze. So here you have a contradiction. The Gemara then backpedals and says, you're right, we don't go and say that Shmuel holds like Rebbe, but rather Shmuel holds like Rabbi Shimon. Ela Shmuel ki Rabbi Shimon svirole. The Omar who said, Chamesh chatois mesois. The 5 chatois that are left to die, that's in all scenarios, no matter when you found the carbon chatos, even if it was before the other one was shechted. V'haroya leRabbi Shimon les leklal. Asked the Gemara, but according to this, they'll never have a scenario where Rabbi Shimon would say that the carbon chatos would be roya, because he would say in all scenarios it would die. Answers the Gemara, Shmuel nami chade ka'omar. You're right, Shmuel himself really only said one statement. We began by saying that Shmuel said 2 statements. We began by saying that Shmuel said, Aleph, that when the carbon chatos is left to die, then the carbon Psachim has the din of that it's brought as a carbon shlomim. The second base of his statement was that when the carbon chatos is left to graze, the carbon pesach is left to graze. Now the Gemara says, you're right, we don't have that second scenario. And Shmuel never said that second scenario. Again, Shmuel nami chad komar. Shmuel was only said one thing. And he said, Kol shebechatos mesa bepesach karev shlomim. He only said the first of the 2 statements. And we just misquoted him. He said when the carbon chatos has the din that it is going to be left to die, the carbon pesach would be brought as a carbon shlomim. Asked the Gemara, my kamash malon. What is Shmuel then coming to teach us? Behold, if it's before Chatzois, then it's not considered to be Avud. And if it's after Chatzois, our Mishnah already states that if you find the Carbon Pesach after Chatzois, then indeed you bring the Carbon Pesach as a Carbon Shlomim. Answers the Gemara, La Pukim Rabbi Yochanan. Shmuel is coming to exclude the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, who says that's totally on the Shechita. That you can only bring, says Rabbi Yochanan, the Carbon Pesach as a Carbon Shlomim if it's found after the Carbon Pesach was already, original Carbon Pesach was, not the second Carbon Pesach was designated, was already shechted. But if you found it before the Carbon Pesach was shechted, then you have to let it to graze. Alma, Shchita Kova. Obviously, according to Rabbi Yochanan, he goes like the Shita of Rabbah, that the Shchita, it's totally on the Shchita itself. On that we're saying, Kamashman Chatzois Kava. Shmuel is coming to teach us that the din is like Rabbi Zeira, that it's Chatzois that is Koveya. And therefore, not like Rabbi Yochanan saying, but rather, if you found the Carbon Pesach after Chatzois, then you'll bring it as a Carbon Shlomim. If you found it before Chatzois, then the din is that you have to leave it to graze. And that's exactly what Shmuel was saying. That when the carbon chatos is left to graze, in the scenario when you found the carbon pesach, that same scenario before the second carbon pesach was shechted, then you'll have to also leave it to graze.